Well, I'm not even going to take a second to mention that today is the 5th birthday of other record labels. Okay, I just mentioned it, but let's move on. Today, I want to talk about, thanks so much for subscribing and watching. And if you're a fan of the podcast, that's where this is all started. If you're not subscribed to the podcast, please check it out. But that started 5 years ago today, which is really exciting. So thank you so much for that. Okay, what I want to talk about is actually how to start, how and why you should start a podcast for your record label. So if you own a record label, if you run a record label, what I want to talk about today is this idea of starting a podcast as just like another marketing touch point for you and your audience. Now, I was actually searching the web for some examples of record label podcasts, and you can let me know in the comments below if you know of any. I remember years ago, I used to listen to one from the Seattle label Tooth and Nail. And I used to listen to a lot of Tooth and Nail when I was in high school. And so I found it kind of nostalgic to listen to, and they were kind of doing it from a historical standpoint where they were highlighting eras and bands and artists from like decades ago. So that was kind of cool. And I think they were, I want to say monthly episodes maybe back then. I'm not sure. I know Polyvinyl did a podcast for a little while as well. I don't think it's been updated recently. But if you, first of all, if you have one with your record label, let me know in the comments below, and I promise I'll check it out. And if there are other ones, other record label podcasts, please let me know as well, and I'll check those out. That'd be cool. So what we're going to talk about today is I got 5 topics on this, how to start a record label. We're going to get really practical and didactic. We're going to talk about objective, like why you should start one. We're going to talk about the frequency, not like sonic frequency, but like how often you should create episodes. Number 3, content. Number 4, recording and distro, real briefly. And then number 5, we're going to talk a little bit about consistency and the importance of being consistent as a podcast. So number 1, let's talk about the objective. When we talk about marketing stuff, we've often talked about the idea of marketing touch points. And there's studies that show that a consumer needs about 7 to 8 touch points with a product or a service or a brand or a company or an artist before being converted, before taking action. And so we've talked a lot about this. And so what that means is there's stuff like word of mouth, like their friends tweeting about a new album, and then maybe seeing an ad in a magazine that they subscribe to, or reading a review on a website that they visit. Maybe they see an Instagram post, or maybe they hear the song on the radio. All of these things add up, and it usually takes 7 or 8 of them before they're finally like, okay, I got to check out this record. And for me, I'm suggesting to you that starting a record label podcast and having a podcast that releases episodes weekly, or more likely monthly episodes, that can just be another touch point that they're like, oh, I'm actually going to check this out. And podcasts are really intimate. So that's another reason why they make for really good marketing touch points. Number 2, people love podcasts, by the way. This goes without saying, but like podcasts are so popular. And I think the reason why people love podcasts so much is because they're intimate, super intimate. A lot of people listen to podcasts on their earbuds. They listen on the train. They listen when they're stuck in traffic. They listen when they're at the gym, on the treadmill, or going for a walk. That's when I listen to podcasts. I will get a new podcast episode. I'll put it on my earbuds, noise canceling earbuds, and go for a walk. And I'm just there with the person listening. And so there is like a super active connection. Whereas like a lot of people listen to music or listen to the radio more passively. Whereas podcasts, I think, are consumed far more actively, and they're far more intimate. And so people love them. So now's a good time to do it. Now, this is another interesting point, is there's far less competition. See, a lot of you are like, I need to get on Reels and Snapchat, or I need to get on TikTok with my record label, or our artists need to promote themselves on TikTok. Well, there's like 40 billion, 100 billion, 400 million, I don't know, people on TikTok right now. And you're like squeezing in there and trying to compete. And I don't know how that's going for you. But to me, what's interesting is like podcasts is it's like there's still millions of podcasts, but like active podcasts, there's like less than like 500,000. Like the bar is like enormously low when it comes to competition. In fact, if you actually search record label podcast, you're going to get my podcast, which is cool, but you're going to get like a handful of record labels. And there are people out there who are like, hey, I want to hear from other people who run record labels. And so they, searching for a record label podcast is going to turn up like a handful of results, as opposed to going to YouTube or Google and searching for record labels, or TikTok, and they're going to get millions of results. And so less competition. It's also a really good way. It's another promotional outlet. We've already talked about that for you and your artists. It's also a really good way for you to connect with your artists. And we'll talk about how, when we talk about the content and you interviewing them and kind of like digging into the making of their latest release. Okay, topic number two, frequency. So how often should you release episodes? Well, the most important thing is that you pick a frequency that is sustainable. So I'm thinking monthly or weekly. Now, let me explain why. So monthly is the most likely option for you guys. Like for all of us, like monthly is the most easily to sustain. So if you were going to highlight one album in your back catalog or your current catalog, you can pick 12 a year, right? If you're going to highlight an artist and you do monthly, do you have 12 artists on your roster? Great. Do you have 6 now and expect to get another 6 in the next 6 months? Great. Monthly is possible. Or maybe one month you highlight an artist and another month you highlight an album, and then maybe the next month you highlight a charity that's really important or a topic. Maybe you bring on like you do songwriting, an episode about songwriting, and you bring on the lead songwriter from each band, or you do an episode talking about drumming and you invite on all the drummers that are on your roster. That could be really cool. So what's most important is that whatever frequency you pick, that you're able to sustain on a regular basis. And I would say monthly or weekly. If you can handle weekly, great. I think you're going to burn out if you try to do weekly. That's 52 unique episodes a year. It's really demanding. If you maybe batch record and like before you launch your podcast, you have like 10 episodes in the bank so you can always stay ahead. That's great. Bi-weekly is a possibility, but the reason why I suggest monthly or weekly is because that is just like a little bit more, fits into human nature a little bit more. Like we're really used to monthly things, right? We get our monthly bills in the mail. We get our magazine subscriptions or our digital subscriptions renew monthly. There's 12 months of the year. They each have their own name. It just seems to like make a lot more sense that we can appreciate and expect a new episode from a podcast that we enjoy to come out once a month. The same thing with weekly. We all do the same thing on Monday and the same thing on Sundays. And I follow YouTubers that release on Sunday nights, and I kind of rely on that. So with human nature, sporadic releases is not good. You'll never get like a dedicated audience if you're just releasing sporadically. Also, bi-weekly is not really natural human-wise. And so I would stick to weekly or monthly. I think for a lot of small operations, monthly is the best way to go for now. Do that for a year. And if things are going great, switch to weekly. Topic number 3, content. Okay, so what are you going to include? Well, I just gave you a great idea in the last topic when I was saying, like, if you were to do monthly episodes and you focus one episode on a topic. So we're going to talk about anti-racism, and we're going to have on people on this panel on the label, and we're going to talk about that. Maybe we're going to talk about drumming. We're going to talk about songwriting. We're going to talk about touring, how much touring is so difficult. Maybe you are interviewing an artist about their creative process. Each month, you take another artist on your label, you talk about their creative process. How's it going with songwriting, that kind of stuff. You can also do an episode on each album. And so interview the band and the artist, the mix engineer, the producer, whoever, to talk about an album that you've released in the past as a way to kind of highlight it. One thing I will recommend, two things I want to recommend when you're creating content or when you're trying to think of like what type of episodes to release on your podcast. Here's what I want to recommend. The first thing is to try to keep it evergreen. So I don't like talking about what's new. I don't think that a podcast should be the place for news. I think keep that to social media, like Instagram stories, tweets, things that disappear. So if you're promoting an upcoming show, like you're doing a big showcase or you're all going to a festival or something, I don't think a podcast is the place to do that. I think nowadays people appreciate going to a podcast feed, going back 3 or 4 years and being like, I'm going to listen to this episode. And if it's full of like super hyper relevant content to that time when it was recorded, then it's going to be super hyper irrelevant when they're listening to it. So my encouragement to you would be to try to keep things evergreen as possible. Try not to mention dates as much. When I was recording my podcast and I was talking about the pandemic, I tried not to mention the pandemic in the early months, just in case it wouldn't really stick around. I wanted to keep my podcast episodes evergreen. Now I talk about the pandemic all the time because it's like just, it's like a part of the everybody's life for so many years. So it doesn't feel like it dates episodes anymore. But just something to keep in mind when you're making podcast episodes is try to keep them evergreen, and I don't think you should use podcasts as a place for news. What I do think you should do with the content of your podcast is provide value to the listener. Put yourself in the shoes of the listeners. Don't do this thing where you're like, you and your co-hosts are like laughing about an inside joke for a half an hour, or just shooting the breeze and like telling me, what did you dream about, or what did you eat for breakfast? I mean, maybe that works, but just don't be overly self-indulgent, because you probably in that moment, like you're more excited about that conversation and you think that it sounds great, but really put yourself in the shoes of the listener and make sure you're providing them value. Remember this. We all consume content selfishly. Like, you're watching this video not because you want to make me feel good about myself. You're watching this because you're trying to get information to help you and your business. You're watching this video selfishly. I'm okay with that. And so remember that when you're doing a podcast, remember that most people, they'll tune in maybe because they're curious, or maybe they want to support you for the first episode, but to subscribe and to watch and listen on a weekly basis, they're going to need to be getting something out of the equation. And so make sure you're providing them value. And so when we talked about doing an episode for drummers, people are going to be listening and going, I'm not a drummer, but I'm kind of curious about how drummers think. Or they're listening and going, I am a drummer. I'm so great to hear from a podcast with other drummers. Same thing about songwriting. And we all love to kind of get like a glimpse in behind the scenes of the creative process, or the mixing process, or the mastering process, or what it's like to be on tour, or what it's like to run your label. Even music fans will be like, I enjoy listening to this podcast because they tell me about what it's like to run a record label, and I just don't know anything about that. And so that's entertaining them. It's providing them with some value. So just make sure that you are providing value. One other thing I'll say about content before we quickly move on is music or no music. So you can use music legally. I think you can use music. I mean, if you upload the music to YouTube, you might get in a little issues with your distributor. I don't know. But if you're the record label, you own the rights to the music, hopefully, so you can use music. I think it's okay to play clips of music. I think it's okay to play a song on the outro of the episode. But just remember that if you're providing value to your listener, people love podcasts that have dialogue, that have like rich conversations. And I just don't think a lot of people use podcasts to listen to music. Now, I could be wrong. And of course, there are people out there, but I feel like we have the radio, and I feel like we have playlists and Spotify for music, and even YouTube for music, and SoundCloud. Whereas I think podcasts listeners kind of expect something different, a little bit more engagement than music. So you can use music, but I would just encourage you to think outside the box a little bit, and do a little bit more dialogue, a little bit more interviews. I did this thing with my artists when they were releasing a record, where we sat on the porch. I grabbed my Zoom recorder. I put it in between us. It was in the summer. We were sharing a beer, or sharing beers, like we had our own beers, and we hit record, and we were just chatting about his new 4-song EP. I didn't have any questions planned. I just asked him about the idea, the album title. And then we talked about all 4 songs. You could hear the birds chirping and the cars driving by. It was a beautiful experience. And we actually released it on Spotify, believe it or not, because I didn't have a podcast at the time. But that's the kind of content that I'm suggesting might be more valuable than just like a playlist of tracks, but totally up to you. Moving on, number 4, recording and distro. I'm going to glaze over this real quickly. Recording, don't overthink it. My favorite podcast on one of my favorite bands, these old guys record it. The audio is atrocious. It's atrocious, but I love the conversation. I love the band that we all love, that we're talking about. And so I listen to every episode, and it's like one of my favorite podcasts, even though the audio is brutal. And I wish they would improve the audio, but I'm still going to listen. So don't overthink the audio too much. And technology has advanced so much these days that like even your iPhone or anything will have, or Zoom, like if you talk over Zoom, you can record the audio for free, download it from Zoom, and you can use that. For distribution, you can just Google like who you want to host your podcast. I've been using Podbean for 5 years, ever since I started the podcast. I'm not affiliated with them. I just Googled it, and some reviews popped up, and I picked them. I've also been running a podcast as an experiment in a separate niche as a hobby using Anchor. And Anchor is like Spotify owns them. So it's a little bit suspect because like I sometimes wonder if they push to Spotify quicker than they push to Apple Music, but I don't think so. I mean, it's a free platform. So I've been using Anchor now for about a year with another podcast and it's been fine. And it's free. So you can check that out. So tech and distro don't let that be a barrier for you. Just use bare bones for now. And as you grow, you can improve your setup later. Finally, number 5, and most importantly, is consistency. Pick a schedule that allows you to be consistent. This is what we talked about. Great pieces of content, when released consistently, will embed themselves into people's daily lifestyle. So this is a case of quantity over quality. When something comes out weekly, every single Monday, or the first Monday of every month, it starts to embed in people's lives and they get used to it and they get excited for it and they get anticipated for it. So honestly, I'm just saying consistency is like more important than quality. It's certainly more important than like audio quality, you know what I mean? And so like just pick a schedule that you can handle. Also pick a format that you can handle. Remember going back to the beginning, we talked about like if you interview all the drummers on your roster and then you interview all the guitarists on your roster, then you interview all the lead singers on your roster. That's 3 months. And so you're meant to fill up 12 episodes. You could probably do like 12 episodes where like you interview all the guys who drive the van on tour, but eventually you're going to run out of ideas. And so pick a format that is sustainable. So if we're talking monthly, I would say, okay, interview episode 1 month, and then the next month we highlight an album in our back catalog. And then the next month we highlight an artist on our roster. And then the next month we highlight a charity or like a social justice topic that is important to you. So if those were weekly episodes, then like once a month you interview an artist, once a month you highlight an album, once a month you talk about an industry tech problem or topic, and then once a month you talk about a social justice issue. So that covers you for the whole month. And if you're doing that for a year, then you'll never run out of episodes ideas. So my episode ideas. So my suggestion here is just make sure that whatever format you pick and whatever schedule you pick is that you can be consistent, because the idea is that, and honestly, the stats, I don't have them here, but the podcast stats are phenomenal because the amount of podcasts with more than 10 episodes is like 250,000. Like there's like millions of podcasts, but like the podcasts that have an episode within the past 2 weeks and that have more than 10 episodes, that number drops down to like 100,000 or 200,000. So it's like, basically my point is like only like 2% podcasts are like regularly updating and stay on a consistent schedule. So when we go back to like having your voice heard and kind of outranking competition, that can't be said about Instagram or TikTok. Whereas on podcasts, if you release on a consistent schedule, you're like now like one of like a dozen of record label podcasts. And that's incredible. So my encouragement to you, first of all, subscribe to my podcast, Other Record Labels, which just turned 5 today. How exciting is that? Check out that podcast. But then my encouragement to you is to start your own podcast. So I'm going to provide a link with all the notes from today's show. It'll be at otherrecordlabels.com/podcasts with an S. And you can read the article that I talked about and the top 5 things, which is like coming up with your objective, picking a frequency, monthly or weekly, I think is smartest. The content, what kind of stuff you're going to cover, to use music or not to use music, and providing value to your audience and keeping your episodes evergreen. Number 4, recording and distribution. There's free options all across the board, so don't overthink it. And number 5, consistency is most important. So pick a format of your show and a schedule for your show that you can stick to consistently forever. That would be awesome. So share with me in the comments below or send me an email once you start your record label podcast. And I promise I'll subscribe and I'll listen to the first episode at least. I'm excited to see that. And if you already have one, let me know. I'd be glad to check it out. Thanks so much for watching.